Hey, it's Shirley. Welcome back to my channel. So today we're going to be talking about cognitive biases. My first exposure to the field of behavioral economics was really through Dan Ariely with his book Predictably Irrational, and of course Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow. I think those books really opened my eyes to the fact that a lot of our decision making is driven by these unconscious influences that we have. Essentially these cognitive biases that we all are subject to, and these biases cause us to make non-optimal decisions because they influence our thinking in ways that may not be entirely objective or accurate or ideal. Cognitive biases can make us make decisions based on faulty reasoning or inaccurate information or emotional reactions rather than being driven by logic and reason. I think it's really important to be made aware of these cognitive biases, not only so that we can be aware of how they influence our own thinking, but also so that we can better understand other people's perspectives and avoid or minimize misunderstandings, because everyone is subject to these biases, and I think that by being aware of that fact, we can also be more empathetic towards and forgiving of other people as well. The first step to counteracting any of these biases is just to be aware of them and to be able to recognize them in ourselves and in others. So let's go through 9 of the most common cognitive biases and how you can counteract each of them. So the first one is confirmation bias, and this is when we tend to seek information that confirms a pre-existing belief or principle that we already have. So we tend to look for, we tend to interpret, and we tend to remember information in a way that basically confirms what we already believe. In order to counteract this, really play devil's advocate with yourself, consider the other perspective, always entertain multiple hypotheses. Actively seek for not only confirming evidence but also disconfirming evidence. Next, we have the availability bias, which is our tendency to rely on really accessible or memorable information rather than relying on the most comprehensive or accurate information when we make our decisions. So sometimes we have certain experiences or memories that are very salient to us, either because they had a strong emotional impact or because they happened very recently, and those tend to be, they live top of mind for us. So when we make a decision, we call upon those recent or really salient memories and experiences, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they are the most comprehensive or reliable memories to call upon when you're trying to make a decision. So in order to counteract this effect, you should always seek diverse sources of information. Don't just rely on the most easily accessible information to you. Also, really critically evaluate the quality of the information that you're basing your decisions on, and try to look past the most recent or memorable experiences that you're drawing on. Next up, we have the anchoring bias. This is the tendency to rely too heavily on one initial piece of information that we encounter when we're making a decision. So say you're trying to figure out the price range of something and you really have no idea how much it would be. So an example of this would be, for any salesperson really, they'll put a price tag out there that is really high. No matter where the conversation goes from there, you're already anchored to that really high starting point. Since anchors tend to have an unconscious effect, the best way to guard against this is to identify a really intentional set of anchors by doing your own independent research, and then if you can, seek the independent opinions of people who have not been anchored. Next up, we have the hindsight bias, which is basically the tendency to think after the fact that we could have predicted that was going to happen. People tend to say hindsight is 20/20, and that is because we tend to look back on the past and think, well, I could have seen this coming based on all these clues and hints, but really in the moment you probably could not have predicted. That's why you didn't know better at the time, and that's why you couldn't have done better. So the hindsight bias doesn't really affect our decision making as much, but you can fall into the trap of feeling guilty or blaming yourself because you feel like you should have known better. If you want to avoid that feeling, you could just keep a more meticulous record of all the information that you have at each stage of the decision-making process, and then you can look back and see how much information you really did have at the time and whether you really had enough information to make the right decision. Next, we have the framing effect. This describes our tendency to be influenced by the way that information is presented or framed to us rather than just relying solely on the information itself. So awareness is really key here. Just Being aware of the frames that we have, why we might have them, what they're causing us to think, and how other people might think about this differently. It can really help to talk to people with different perspectives here because they likely have different frames. Another common bias is the overconfidence bias, which really manifests in three main ways: over precision, overestimation, and over placement. Over precision manifests in the sense that we tend to make overly precise judgments and we believe that they're accurate. Overestimation is believing that we're better at something than we actually are. And then over placement is believing that we're better than others. Overconfidence is probably an overarching cognitive bias that we have, because when we're overconfident, we essentially stop seeking disconfirming evidence. We basically don't believe that we are fallible to any cognitive biases, and so we believe that we're right. Some ways that can help us counter our overconfidence: we can seek feedback from other people and ask them for a very candid and honest assessment. We could test our assumptions and actively seek out evidence that contradicts our beliefs. We can also think in terms of probabilities to assess the actual likelihood of different outcomes and consider the base rate or the frequency with which certain outcomes actually occur in the general population. And we could also keep a record of our past performance and decisions. Next, we have the sunk cost fallacy or escalation of commitment fallacy. And this is when we tend to continue to invest in or escalate our commitment to something just because we've already invested a lot of time and energy and resources, even if it's no longer rational or profitable to do so. This is where the idiom throwing good money after bad comes from. And in order to remedy this, you really just have to remember that sunk costs are sunk. No matter what you do going forward, they're still going to be sunk whether you give up or not. So only consider the costs and benefits going forward. Don't consider what you've already invested in the past. Next is the negativity bias, which is our tendency to pay more attention to negative information and experiences while tending to discount or ignore more positive experiences. As humans, we tend to be more loss averse than risk seeking or gain seeking, and generally we want to avoid the pain of a loss because that to us feels greater than the joy of a gain, which is why we likely have a negativity bias. But of course, there are times and situations when this is non-optimal. So to counteract that, we should practice gratitude and mindfulness and focus on the more positive aspects. We can also actively seek out more positive information and experiences and challenge negative thoughts. Last but not least, we have the bandwagon effect, and this is basically the tendency to just follow the crowd. We tend to conform to the beliefs and actions of a group, even if they're not entirely rational. This makes a lot of sense given that we are social creatures. A sense of belonging and sense of having a social group is really just ingrained in us because it was core to our survival. We had to be liked and accepted by other people. It's how we've always been. We've always been very tribal, and I think it's still a very primal drive within us. It's almost a need to be liked, but we don't want to be just blindly following others just because it's the popular thing to do. So to counteract the bandwagon effect, we should evaluate the evidence independently and do our own research, and also just get really clear on our own values and principles, because even if something might actually be right for everyone else, it still might not be right for you. I really think that becoming more conscious of our own cognitive biases just helps us think more critically so that we're not just subject to the whims of our own unconscious psychology. So hopefully this will help us improve our decision making, our ability to communicate with and understand other people, just generally be more intentional with our lives. I hope you found this video helpful. If you have any other questions, let me know in the comments and I'll see you again soon.